Hi, and welcome to the lesson 1.09 less than equal instructional video for part B of the U.S. History course. If you go to the left side of your course, underneath the Unit 1 tab, you'll find lesson 109 down here on the list, accompanied with a checkpoint that is optional and not graded in part B of the course. Remember, you can use these as practice, but they are not gradable items in your gradebook. For this particular lesson, we're going to be taking a look at pages 584 to 598 in your textbook. There is a reading guide for this lesson, and you can access that reading guide on the third slide of your online lesson and download it here. There is also an online activity called the Washington, Dubois, and Garvey online activity that you will be completing for this lesson as well. In this particular lesson, we're looking at the situation of inequality for African Americans in the South after the Reconstruction period. If you remember, when Reconstruction ended, that meant that the Union forces, the Union military, left the South as it became part of the Union once again, as it became a whole and United States of America. When that happened, in the South, the social system tried to go back to as close to a system of slavery as possible without slavery actually being put into place. So inequality in the South was rampant. It was very difficult for African Americans to move up in society or do well economically. Goals for this lesson are to describe the effects of economic and social racism on Black Americans at the turn of the 20th century. It's also to identify Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois and their achievements. They were leaders in an effort to get equality for African Americans and had two very different points of view and methods. We want to explain the different approaches of improving life for African Americans taken by Washington, Du Bois, and Garvey, as we say here in our third goal for the lesson. So let's take a look at our reading, our pages in the textbook. At this point, you should have your reading guide downloaded and printed off so that you could record answers. You could write your answers as you read. Very important to do that, as we found in part A of the course. The reading guides serve as a great summary and study tool for you when it comes to test time for unit tests, as well as how helpful it will be for the final exam. Let's take a look at our reading. I mentioned in our remediation session for the midterm for part A of the course that course titles and headings are very important, and you will see me use these a lot to point out areas where you can find out information in the textbook. The chapter title is The Road to Equality for this chapter, and it starts out by talking about what the situation was in the South after the Civil War, after Reconstruction had ended, and the South once again had its own local state governments under their own control. As we saw right after Reconstruction, those African Americans who had held political positions quickly found themselves removed from those positions and going back into a society of extreme racism. In fact, they use a system of Jim Crow laws to segregate the South after Reconstruction, and this meant that society was separated by black and white. And in public, you had different services for each group. As you can see in the image over here on page 587, it shows colored only, and it says police order, meaning it was enforced by law. So African Americans and whites were forced to be separate in public. Clearly, it was really the African Americans who were being forced to be separate. So that's what segregation means. A segregated society is a society in which races are separated, and this was really beginning during Reconstruction in the 1870s. Okay. Now, it was supported by the law. Actually, the law Plessy versus Ferguson, the court case that went to the Supreme Court, established that separate but equal facilities were legal as long as separate facilities were provided, as long as they were the same and provided the same services that segregation in the South was legal. However, over time, you could easily see that the separate facilities for African Americans were definitely not equal, but segregation continued in the South. Okay. And as we see, not only was segregation an issue, but restrictions on voting rights was a big issue. Disenfranchise is a term that means to take away voting rights. Okay, so disenfranchise is defined here for you. So just disenfranchisement was a basically an open practice in the South, trying to find different ways to deny African Americans the right to vote, even though they had it as a result of the 15th and 14th Amendments. So different ways that they did this, some southern states would require a literacy test, which was very difficult to pass. And the way that many whites got out of it was something called the grandfather clause. If your grandfather had voting rights, you were exempt from or excused from these very difficult literacy tests, which ends up meaning that most whites whose grandfathers had voting rights were able to be excused from these difficult tests, but African Americans were not. And even though they did their best to educate themselves and take these tests, they were created with the intent to keep African Americans from voting. In addition to literacy tests, they also use poll taxes. And this was another very discriminatory practice in which a tax was required to vote. Now, in Southern society, where African Americans were kept at the bottom rung of the socio and economic ladder, this meant that African Americans didn't have a lot of money. So if you had to pay to vote, many African Americans could not. Lynching was another part of Southern society and actually was a part of mob rule, in which African Americans were frequently targeted as acts of violence and murder. These were not official systems of justice, even though they tried to make it look as if justice was being done and it was mob rule or mob justice. But this was frequently done as a form of intimidation to keep African Americans down on the lowest rung of the social order, and also for entertainment. For many white Southerners, many of these events were recorded. The sound was recorded. Many of them took on a festive feel to it. Very difficult for us to understand today, but at the time this was part of a social status, a social system in the South to keep African Americans at the bottom of the social order. Okay. There was also a convict lease system in which African Americans who found themselves in jail were frequently put on a chain gang and forced to do labor, which didn't really do anything but reestablish this system of forced labor in the South for many African Americans. So the South was a very dangerous place to be, and a very unequal place to be for African Americans. And this is the reason for the Great Migration. Lots of African Americans would flee the South looking to the North to try to find a better way of life. People like Ida B. Wells were crusaders for justice, people who wrote about the injustices of lynchings and the mentality in the South, but these people put themselves at great peril and by going against the system and put themselves in jeopardy. Ida B. Wells spoke out about the lynching system and tried to get people's attention, and did so quite successfully, despite the fact that she was frequently threatened, and eventually did leave the South to continue her writing and her campaign of awareness. Now, Jim Crow in the North was sometimes established. Life for African Americans in the North wasn't easy either. But the way that African American leaders tried to change things for the better for their people differed greatly. People like Booker T. Washington felt that African Americans needed to improve themselves economically through their own work, through the existing system of white supremacy, show their worth and show their economic value by becoming store owners, by becoming involved in important trades and becoming valuable members of society, improving their worth in that way. Washington was very much a person on the outside saying that African Americans should work within the existing system of white supremacy. But privately, he worked within the circles of people that he knew to try to, of course, find better equality for African Americans. He was simply having this position of appeasement on the outside to get into white circles and to get his voice heard. Now, folks like leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, he was a very educated man, as was Booker T. Washington, but had a very different view. He believed in full equality. He wanted segregation to end. He did not believe in touting a view of acceptance of any kind of white supremacy, and also was very instrumental in starting the Niagara movement. Okay. This meeting was called for an immediate end to Jim Crow practices. He was very much against the current system, and keep in mind, he was not born as a slave as Booker T. Washington was, so he had very different views. Marcus Garvey is the last one that we're really focusing on in this chapter here in your reading, and his views and strategies was very anti-white. He actually took a much more militant view. He was an immigrant coming into the country, trying to get people to getting his people to be a little bit more militant about their views and their goals, forcing equality and demanding equal treatment in a much more militant way. He was a Jamaican immigrant who arrived in New York in 1916, but eventually was actually kicked out of the country because of his controversial views and some of his more seedy exploits. All three of these men have very different points of view. You need to know them and be able to compare and contrast them. That's the end of your reading for this portion of the lesson, for this lesson. Once you get onto page 3 of the course, you can go into your online activity and differentiate between Du Bois, Garvey, and Washington by going through the activity to match the statement that appears here in the conversation bubble with the person. This says there can be no friendship and harmony with white people. We must learn to live separately. And that was the thought of Marcus Garvey. So you need to move the conversational bubble to the person it applies to, and then go to the next as you work through the activity. Once you've completed this, you can do the checkpoint as practice. It is there and available to you. If you click on it, it will open up. But again, remember that this activity is not graded. You would be putting in here the word that you got after completing the Washington, Du Bois, and Garvey activity. It's a very good review in preparation for your 110 quiz. And that's the conclusion for the 109 less than equal instructional video. If you have any questions, please let me know.